Unelotong instead, old job.
Hello and welcome to Same Old News with your host Josh. Episode 3.5 Interlude, Confronting the Whig Interpretation. Hello everyone and welcome to the second season of Same Old News, the show which analyses the press in history to show that not much has really changed. I'm your host Josh, and this week we are having a bit of an interlude. When this episode is released, I will be in the air flying back to Britain for the holidays. Therefore, I did not have time to record a full episode for this week. But I did predict this in advance, and I do have an episode for you today, as you can hear, which will act as a bit of a palate cleanser before we get into our final two episodes for this season. One thing that comes with the territory of working on a PhD and academia in general is publicising your findings and research. It is a required element of your work. So the most common way you do this is through journal articles, books, blogs, and conference papers. Conference papers tend to be a 20-minute presentation based on some element of your research, followed by questions from the audience regarding what it is you have presented. This can lead to some really thought-provoking conversations which can aid your research, thinking of different angles which you hadn't considered before. So I did one last month at Monash University's HDR History Conference, where I presented a paper titled Confronting the Whig Interpretation of Press History in Britain and its Empire. You'll be hearing the full recording in just a moment, but before we start, just a quick note. I presented this paper with a PowerPoint as reference, which I do refer to a few times since I am making use of images. If you want to listen to this paper with the PowerPoint included, then please go to my YouTube channel name Same Old News, to hear this paper with the slides that I was using. Anyway, that's enough from me. I will shut up now and I will let you hear this paper, Confronting the Whig Interpretation of Press History in Britain and its Empire.
1780 to 1830, explores the conservative press of the late Georgian period in Britain and its empire through its impact in British politics and networks of imperial communication. Josh is particularly interested in the application of global historical methodologies in relation to Britain and its empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. And his paper today is Confronting the Whig Interpretation of Press History in Britain and its Empire.
Right, good morning everyone. It's great to see such an amazing turnout for this conference today. As has been introduced, I'm looking at what's known as the Whig interpretation of history in Britain and its empire. And I think to confront this issue that I'll be discussing today, I would think it would be best to start with the present state of the press and media. There we go. Media, especially the press media, is, I would say, currently struggling with a sort of legitimacy crisis against newer media forms with the rise of the internet. Social media has posed this sort of new rival, but also an aid for established media. Private Eye, which is a political magazine in the UK, actually poked fun at this in a sort of cartoon in 2017, decrying the state of modern journalism, where everyone's just copying stuff off of social media instead of investigative journalism. Going hand in hand with this, though, is the seemingly increased discussion and questioning of bias in press media and the news we consume on a daily basis. This has not increased, though. I think it's just become a lot more visible with newer media forms. The need to find and check political bias has also bled into more official sources. Where I'm from in the UK, one of our biggest polling sites, YouGov, has now added questions on media bias to their regular polling, especially with the BBC, our state-owned broadcasting company. Biannual polls on BBC bias have been in place since about February 2020, as well as also petitions being sent to the UK House of Commons being signed calling for inquiries into the BBC's supposed bias. While these are interesting in their own ways, I think they hit at an enshrined misunderstanding of what the purpose of the press and news is in general. In fact, it hits at the issue that I really want to focus in on today. The idea of the press and news media as a pillar of democracy, freedom of speech, or the vague notion of progress, which I think is both an externally enshrined and a self-styled notion. I think there is an element of truth to it, but the overarching idea is both a misunderstanding and an enforced interpretation. The press in general, in my opinion, has been and continues to be just another pillar of politics. And this is not to place morality or judgment on the issue, it's more my reflection on what I think the state of it actually is. I think the idea of the press as that sort of fourth estate has been part fueled actually by previous academic work on the history of the press, which has legitimated the idea of the press as this sort of pillar of democracy. The main culprit of which, the Whig interpretation, will be the perspective I shall be confronting and hopefully providing a semblance of a solution to in today's paper. The press, in my opinion, needs to be re-understood, both in the present as well as historically, as a public media forum which was designed to act for political motives. So in today's paper, I'll be untangling the holds that the Whig interpretation has had in histories of the British press, both domestically and imperially, showing its presence and where it actually might be waning. I will then, through the example of a journalist called William Maginn, be proposing different methods that we can use to move away from this sort of idea. So the first thing we need to address is what I actually mean when I say the Whig interpretation. The term itself was coined by historian Herbert Butterfield all the way back in 1931 in his book, rather imaginatively titled The Whig Interpretation of History. And it is in this book where we get our understanding of what this term means, as well as what historical methods constitute it. Butterfield is most concerned with the moralization of historical events and conflicts, placing them into this sort of binary of good versus bad. In these, Butterfield argues, quote, "The party that is more analogous to the present is taken to be more similar, more modern than close examination would justify," end quote. From his analysis, and those of historians in the near century since, this was a consistent technique conducted by historians in the Victorian period, especially in Britain. Butterfield shows that Victorian histories of two of these struggles in particular as being the biggest culprits. The one which is most relevant for this paper today is what he terms the Whigs of 1800. In essence, the Whig Party, as well as reformist political forces and the press in the early 19th century, were presented as the good guys, or the group more analogous to the present, to borrow from Butterfield's phrasing. They were presented as vanquishing political corruption of the Tories, expanding the voter franchise, emancipating Catholics in wide-reaching religious reforms, and abolishing slavery. This period of British history does tend to be termed as the Age of Reform in historiography. The political history of this period, though, has since been reanalysed and reinterpreted to provide a much more critical lens to this. And yet, I would say the histories of the press in this same period have not followed this trend, or should I say not as quickly. The histories of the British press in this period have usually followed the hallmark of liberal and radical press sources pushing against state censorship, as well as newspapers that were supposed mouthpieces or bought papers for the string of Tory and Conservative governments in the early 19th century. Making use of liberal and radical press sources feeds into this narrative by presenting events from their perspective with usually little comparison to a large host of conservative pro-government sources at the same time. The rhetoric of fighting for freedom of expression or independence from government censorship and funding were prevalent in these sources, the radical and liberal ones that is, which slants the analysis as a whole. The main focus, though, has been on the development of a supposedly independent press in the early 19th century and so on that represents the public opinion being argued by many recent press historians such as G.A. Cranfield, Hannah Barker, Carl Schweitzer and Martin Hewitt, just to name a few. This has been recently challenged, though, by James Curran and Jane Seaton back in 1981 in their work Power Without Responsibility. It has helped to reanalyse the press as being within an overarching structure of power in the form of censorship, as opposed to the Whiggish analysis from other historians. In their analysis, the censoring power in the 19th century transfers from government, law, and political parties to businesses and the larger market as a whole. In other words, the newspaper press is beholden to money, whatever sells, essentially. A similar story can be told of the developing newspaper press in British colonies in this period. As an asterisk that I put there, the British Caribbean newspapers are a notable exception, with analysis of the presence of pro-slavery networks in the British press. My co-supervisor David Lambert has done a lot of great work on this. My research thus far, though, has honed in on East India Company-controlled India, as well as Cape Colony in what we may know today as present-day South Africa. One thing I need to state here, though, that I can't expand on too heavily due to time constraints, is that the political dimensions of the press in British colonies cannot be treated as a sort of carbon copy of the political dynamics of the press in Britain itself. In my opinion, they feel more like forced, rough imitations of the press back home as a way of the colonists sort of proving their English identity. The newspaper was seen as something inherently English in itself. Therefore, the way we define these newspapers' political outlooks needs to be treated a bit more delicately. However, since I'm yet to find a solid definition for colonial dynamics, I'm going to continue to use the terms conservative, liberal, and radical for the sake of simplicity. The histories of the press in these two colonies have followed a similar script. Histories for each colony have paid attention to about 2 liberal to radical newspapers each. In Cape Colony, historians such as John Mackenzie and Radolf Vinje have focused on the push for political and press freedoms in the autocratic Crown colony, especially under the Tory governor Lord Charles Somerset. The two papers they focus on are the South African Journal and the South African Commercial Advertiser. While for India, the common theme has been to analyse Anglophone newspapers that got the publishers banished from India itself, Hickey's Bengal Gazette and the Calcutta Journal, just to name a sample. A further issue, though, that I've especially seen in the case of India, I've come across in my own research, is the political nature of colonial newspaper archival resources. Callie Wilkinson wrote an excellent article earlier this year in the American Historical Review, which explored this, especially with the British newspaper archive in the British Library, where they have been privileging digitising domestic papers over colonial ones. Recently, digitisation has started to bring in colonial papers, especially in early English Indian ones. But there's also this privileging of liberal/radical opinion in these newspapers, with the ones that have been chosen for collection and digitisation. And this has been reflected by the papers that have been chosen for analysis. It becomes this sort of feedback loop, as it were. So this brings in the question of how to remedy this. Some historians have recently, in the past couple of decades, been analysing conservative press sources, such as James Sachs' seminal work on From Jacobite to Conservative. But many works on sort of the conservative press of this period, such as Mark Philp and Kevin Gill-Martin, have tended to focus purely on loyalist publications in the 1790s in response to the French Revolution, rather than conservatism in this period more holistically. And so I have 3 sort of ideas that we could do to identify the contemporary conservative sources. Going issue by issue can be helpful to get a general idea of conservatism. So you'll get things like protectionism and anti-free trade, anti-Catholicism, being against general political reform put forward by liberals and radicals, as well as supporting the maintenance of a fused church and state, which at the time was known as Anglicanism. All of this could be encapsulated into the contemporary rhetoric of protecting the Protestant constitution. And I will come back to that phrase later. However, this method is rather arbitrary and does not account for the complexities of political ideology. Ideology is a lot more fluid than political scientists like to admit, especially in historical analysis, with sometimes wildly varying opinions, especially on these issues that I've just mentioned. So if we're talking about a more fractured and fluid ideology, we need to observe it on a bit more of a granular level. Analysing individual writers and their networks can provide an insight into the more continuities and divides within the conservative press of this period. It's not really a monolithic whole. One other thing that can be observed is also the politics of style. What I mean by this is how something is written, the style of it. So theses, satires, poetry, book reviews, etc., etc. And I want to focus in on satire for the rest of this paper, as this is one of the ones which is a bit weirder than the other styles, where it can show a conservative parallel with radicalism, which is the two sort of, at least seen generally as the two diametric opposites of this period. However, satire and personal attacks, sort of crossing this line between what you can say of someone's private life and then their public statements, was a common trope used by the more fringe elements of the conservative press, a style shared by radical writers of the time as well. So for the rest of my time in this paper today, I'm going to be briefly looking at how these three methods can sort of come together with the example of William Maginn, the self-styled doctor. And here he is in what I can only describe as the most stereotypically conservative pose you could imagine. Born in Cork, Maginn, in his upbringing, witnessed the Irish Rebellion of 1798 and Jacobinism, and was drilled in his education by pro-Anglican educators at Trinity College, Dublin, which was the university for the Protestant ascendancy, which was a group of Anglo-Irish families that colonised Ireland throughout the early modern period. Maginn made his name in the conservative press of Edinburgh and London across all of those papers that you can see on screen, and many more. So many I could not list them all on this slide. His wide reach came through the patronage and recommendation of the many friends he made, such as John Gibson Lockhart and John Wilson Croker, who were all involved in these papers. Croker in particular wrote of Maginn to the then Prime Minister Robert Peel in 1835, saying, quote, "I believe he has libelled both you and me," end quote, but he saw Maginn as a powerful and has been a useful partisan writer. He is a zealous conservative. And his conservatism is what was known as ultra-Toryism, at least later in the period, which was defined by rampant anti-Catholicism, pro-slavery opinions, but also pro-reform, which is one of the weirder points that I want to break down, through the fact that he took on a satirical style, what was known as abuse in this period. And one of the ways he did this was through Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine and his series The Noctes Ambrosianae, which literally means Nights at Ambrose's Tavern, which was an actual tavern in Edinburgh, apparently. So in this series, he publicly reveals a real and imagined circle of confidants and colleagues, and the way these worked, it would be a scripted play in each of these articles, with all of the main contributors to Blackwood's in their pseudonyms. For context, you see there's a name called O'Doherty, that is Maginn, one of his most famous pseudonyms, Sir Morgan O'Doherty Baronet, which was to indicate his Irish heritage. The content of these scenes all took place over dinners, and would have them having general discussions of publications going on at the time, making up political chants and songs. I'm going to save you my terrible singing voice for those chants, but also espousing the good of the Tory party. For example, this one I've got here, which the dashes indicate line breaks for the poems, but they say, for example, "He who prates of reform in Parliament, send him adrift to the right or left. Why need we care what the big Whig Charlie meant, whether 'twas treason or was theft?" This is targeted at Earl Grey, accusing his attempts at reform as the head of the parliamentary Whigs as horrific, treasonous, neither being good result for the nation or that Protestant constitution I mentioned earlier, because one of his big problems was that Catholics weren't part of the Protestant constitution in his eyes. You're seeing that sort of zealous conservatism in line with the Tory party. But by the late 1820s, he is outraged with the passing of the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829 by the then Tory government run by the Duke of Wellington. He sees it as a bit of a betrayal of Tory principles, and he becomes this sort of ultra-Tory that I mentioned earlier. And he saw his ultra-Toryism as true Toryism as opposed to the government Toryism of names such as the Duke of Wellington, future Prime Minister Robert Peel, former Prime Minister the late George Canning, as well as the aforementioned John Wilson Croker. So he used his outlet as the editor of Fraser's magazine to write a satirical series called The Election of the editor of Fraser's magazine, which in itself is poking fun at the corrupt system of politics in terms of the election struggles. Which is quite interesting, because he used his outlets to argue that the political binary of the Whigs and Tories had been irrevocably broken because of liberal Toryism. The whole system was broken. He saw his previous system as no longer existing. So for Maginn, contrary to established Tory principles, felt that reform was the only way to save the Constitution. That was his sort of logic. And in this series of 3 articles, they were all satirical, taking jabs at the perceived corrupt system, infecting the Tory party from liberals and radicals. He poked fun at this by saying nothing like it had ever been seen or heard before. On all similar occasions, the corrupt influence and undue partialities of the booksellers have ever been exercised. Pardon me. The gathering sang songs aimed squarely at 2 other guests in this satirical and fake election, being Wellington and Croker, who were for some reason there. They were used as sort of jabs. David Lattenay reveals, though, that the winner of this election was a man in his 20s called Oliver York, aka William Maginn's brand new pseudonym. And there's a question of why he chose a brand new pseudonym as opposed to his previous ones. And I think it's mainly York needed to be presented as a new, fresh face on the scene to act as a sort of puppet for Maginn pushing his level of conservatism. York, later on in the series, used his position to write a speech espousing what Fraser's magazine would be about, but also pushing his form of Toryism. To quote, "We here, thank God, are in the opposition to his Grace the Duke of Wellington. He and ourselves in times bygone rowed in the same boat. We were then in the upper ranks of the friends of the government. But since his Grace ratted, which was a very common term he used in these articles, we honest Tories have veered round to the opposition." From even this quote alone, we see a conservative press and ideology, a conservatism, which is further complicated our understanding of the late Georgian press and politics, as opposed to what the Whig interpretation would have you believe. Seemingly calcified monolithic ideologies are actually much smaller factions and groups across a much wider political spectrum, especially in the press. Not only is a fringe of conservative press engaging against the government that was supposedly the Tories that they were supposed to be supporting, at least in the Whig interpretation, they also shared, in some cases, some similarities of style with the radical press's penchant for libel and public attacks, what we may know today as defamation. This is the complexity. This is the political understanding that needs to be appreciated a lot more when writing the history of the press in general, but especially the British press. Thank you, and I open up the floor to questions.
Thank you, Josh.
I have it's like a half-formed question. So when I'm thinking about politics of style in this, do you notice specific literary influences on the way they write? Because that whole fake play strikes me as very Plato, but when you were reading it out, it was kind of Shakespearean in the lyrical style. So are there specific literary references that they kind of draw from in the conservative press?
Maginn specifically does reference Shakespeare quite a lot. One of the papers he wrote for was Literary Gazette, where he started out his career under another pseudonym, P.P. Crossman. And he wrote also literary works, stories, which underneath had this sort of venomous political tone to it. The styles being used at the time, though, I couldn't explore this because also I'd have to get into the definitions of what I mean by satire in this period. It's been split into three different ways, which is Juvenalian, Horatian, and radical satire. Juvenalian means very pointed attacks on a person, on their actual character. Horatian is what you may understand more today as sort of poking fun at the present situation, a bit more hearty. But satirical works generally followed a general structure, which was you would focus on one vice and one virtue, to quote Gary Dyer's work in 1997. You'd start off with poking at what the issue was, and then you would then sort of contrast it to what you thought the virtue was that should be focused in on. And you do see these when you read Noctes in a lot more extensive fashion. It starts off, one of them that I read the other day, for example, Noctes Ambrosianae 20, there's quite a lot of them. They focused in on Lord Brougham, who was arguing about how to actually educate the working classes, which they say this is just a way to infect the working classes' minds with radical and liberal ideas. And they say how the Tory party is actually how you should educate them and send them in the right direction. So there's this idea of that's the general structure these ones would take.
Josh, I might take my chair prerogative and ask you a question.
Sure.
I'm thinking of your sources. How are you sort of funneling down and working out what to read?
This is one thing I've spoken with my supervisors quite a lot. We discuss it every meeting because there is with each passing day I see more and more newspapers which are actually quite conservative in nature. So the list keeps expanding every day. I think when it comes to the actual newspapers themselves, we can also get into other documents which sort of inform the newspaper press. Penelope Caulfield makes a good argument about how the press is just one strand of the general media landscape in the early 19th century in the Georgian period. And so we can also talk about the external stuff. But with the newspapers, it's a case of where currently I'm focusing on the politics of style in terms of making an argument for a specific chapter of my work, which is looking at the more satirical and ultra-Tory politics of the late 1820s. So it comes back to sort of my issue of how do we define it? And this is something I'm still wading through in my work in terms of how do we narrow this conservative paper as opposed to this one. It's a question of do we take in the statistics of which ones were sold more, which I think is a bit of an inaccurate way of looking at it, so I don't really look into the circulation rates as much because they're unreliable data. But also, it can be just an indication of who's involved in terms of who are the editors, who are the writers. That can also give an indication if it's like with William Maginn, where he's very common across the conservative press. Where he is can give you a better indication of somebody who is very conservative. Those newspapers would probably be the better ones to look at and look at the network within that.
Okay. Also, too, though, you mentioned Britain and the Empire, so that's also huge.
Yes.
So,
It's very
which
huge.
bits of the Empire are you thinking about?
So, at this moment, I'm very sorry, I have ruled out Australia at this present moment in time. I do apologise for that. It's just that that's one of the colonies that I am not as familiar with in my work. I still look at it from time to time because one thing that you look at with imperial press is that they reference other colonies and their newspapers. So I've been using that to sort of, reverse engineer looking at other papers which I can't access as of yet. So I said recently I've been focusing in on India and Cape Colony. And I think the reason why I want to focus in on those two is because India had, East India Company controlled India, I should say, had very much set in press regulations established in 1799 by the Governor-General Richard Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington's brother. It's a very incestuous system, colonial offices. So they had a very established system of press regulations which sort of are emphasised and then sort of retracted depending on how, what's the word I'm looking for, how dire the political situation is deemed to be, how much of a threat is there for the government to be overtaken by Jacobins or revolutionaries. So in India you see that sort of flow, and within those flows you see more conservative papers popping up. So that's with the India case. Cape Colony is, again, a very different, every colony has its own sort of individual complexities and issues that needs to be treated delicately with each situation. The reason why, though, I'm choosing those two is because, on a more frank level, there's a lot more written about it in the press that I've seen so far, and so it provides a lot larger corpus of information to deal with.
Thank you. Have we got any more questions? Well, thank you, Josh.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Same Old News. Next time we shall be returning to our regularly scheduled programming and focusing on a man named John Barrow, whom we have mentioned before, and his path through the British world and press in the 19th century. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like or give a rating, and then subscribe or give us a follow depending on where it is that you're listening. Also, please do follow our socials, links are in the description, so you don't miss any new content coming out over the next few weeks. But with all that being said, thank you so much once again for listening, and I shall see you soon for the Same Old News. Bye for now.
Suka